My name is Elena Marsh, and I'm 39 years old. 3 days after my husband Daniel died. His mother had his obituary reprinted in the Sunday paper without my name in it, and told the funeral director in front of me that I was just someone he was seeing. 5 days after that, his adult children from his first marriage changed the locks on the flagship building of the family's real estate portfolio, the one Daniel and I had spent 11 years building together, before his memorial service had even happened. I said nothing. I hired no lawyer of my own. I signed whatever they put in front of me, and I let them believe, for the better part of 4 months, that I was exactly who they'd already decided I was. A woman who'd married into money and was about to walk away with nothing, quietly, without a fight. What none of them knew, sitting across from me at the final estate hearing, watching their own attorney's face go slowly, visibly pale as he read one paragraph out loud from a document he'd apparently never fully reviewed, was that 18 months before his death, my husband had made one quiet, deliberate change to the family trust, a change his own longtime attorney had simply never gotten around to disclosing to anyone, because nobody had ever thought to ask. Before I tell you what that paragraph said, if you've ever been erased from a story you actually helped build, by people who decided your grief didn't count as much as their greed, take a second and subscribe, but only if this actually means something to you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I promise you, I understand exactly what it costs to grieve someone while the people around you are already fighting over what's left, before you've even had the chance to fully understand what you've lost. Let me take you back to where this all started, because you can't understand what happened at that hearing without understanding the 11 years that came before it, and everything they quietly, gradually taught me about how this particular family measured a person's worth. I met Daniel Ashworth Marsh at 31, at a real estate industry conference in Chicago I'd attended almost by accident, filling in for a colleague at the corporate law firm where I worked at the time as a mergers and acquisitions associate. I want to be clear from the beginning about who I was before I met Daniel, because it matters enormously to how this story ends. I was not a woman without a career or without options when I fell in love with him. I had spent 7 years building a genuinely successful practice at a respected Chicago firm, handling complex commercial transactions worth tens of millions of dollars, on a partnership track that most people in my cohort would have described, without exaggeration, as enviable. Daniel was 42 when we met, recently divorced, running the day-to-day operations of Ashworth Properties, a mid-sized commercial real estate development firm his own father had founded decades earlier and that Daniel had, by that point, grown considerably through a series of careful, well-structured acquisitions across the Midwest. We fell in love slowly and then, as these things sometimes go, very suddenly, over the course of about a year of long dinners and longer phone calls, and we married 2 years after we met, in a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside the city that I still think about, more than a decade later, with an uncomplicated tenderness that nothing about what came after has ever managed to fully tarnish. Daniel had 2 adult children from his first marriage. Bradley, who was 26 when we married and already working within Ashworth Properties in a business development role, and Caroline, 23, finishing a graduate degree in urban planning that Daniel had proudly funded in full. His mother, Vivian Ashworth, was the family's true matriarch in every meaningful sense, a formidable woman in her late 60s who had, by all accounts, been deeply involved in her late husband's original business decades earlier, and who continued to view Ashworth Properties, even in her retirement, as fundamentally, permanently hers. I want to give you an early memory that captures the shape of how Vivian, in particular, viewed me from the very beginning, because I think specific moments tell you more than general impressions ever can. At our engagement dinner, held at Vivian's house 8 months before the wedding, she raised a toast that was, on its surface, gracious and warm. She welcomed me to the family, said kind things about how happy I made Daniel, and then, near the end of it, glancing around the table with a small, knowing smile, she added, "Of course, we'll want to get the paperwork sorted properly before the wedding. Daniel's worked so hard for everything he has, and I'm sure Elena understands that." Everyone laughed, the easy, knowing laugh of people who trust the speaker and don't examine the words too closely. I smiled and said truthfully that I understood completely, and I want to be honest that I did understand genuinely without any resentment. A prenuptial agreement protecting a family business built over decades struck me, as a corporate attorney myself, as entirely reasonable, and I signed one 6 weeks before the wedding, that I reviewed carefully with independent counsel and found to be fair, if conservative, in its terms. But I want you to notice something about that toast, because it set the tone for the following decade in a way I didn't fully appreciate until much later. Vivian's welcome to the family arrived already wrapped around a question about what I might try to take from it. Not who I was. Not what I might contribute. What I might extract. That framing never fully left the room, in any gathering, for the next 11 years.
I left my law firm 2 years into the marriage, a decision I want to describe honestly, because I know how it can sound in a story like this, and I don't want to misrepresent my own agency in making it. Daniel's business was expanding rapidly during that period, acquiring 2 additional commercial properties in a single 18-month stretch, and the operational and legal complexity of that growth had become genuinely difficult to manage with the existing structure Ashworth Properties had in place. A single overworked outside counsel handling everything from lease negotiations to zoning disputes to the increasingly complicated financing structures Daniel needed to fund the expansion. I offered, initially simply to help review a few contracts on the side, using the exact skill set I'd spent 7 years building at my firm. Within a year, that informal help had become, in practice, a full-time, unpaid general counsel role, handling nearly all of the company's legal and structural work that any outside firm would have billed, conservatively, at several $100,000 annually. I want to be honest that I made this choice willingly because I loved Daniel and I loved the work, and because Daniel himself, unlike the rest of his family, treated my contribution with genuine, consistent respect. He called me more than once in front of colleagues and eventually in front of his own family. The reason this company didn't fall apart during the Meridian Tower acquisition. A deal I'd personally restructured after the original financing fell through 11 days before closing. I want to tell you about that specific deal in more detail because it's the clearest example I have of exactly what my contribution to this business actually looked like underneath 11 years of Vivian's careful reframing. Ashworth Properties had been under contract to acquire the Meridian Tower site for 4 months, with a construction loan already partially syndicated across 3 regional lenders, when the lead lender's credit committee, spooked by a sudden regional downturn in commercial occupancy rates, withdrew its commitment 11 days before the scheduled closing. Daniel called me from the office at nearly midnight, genuinely panicked in a way I'd rarely seen from him, certain the entire deal, and with it a significant portion of the company's growth strategy for the following 3 years, was about to collapse. I spent the next 9 days, essentially without sleep, restructuring the entire financing package from scratch, unwinding the syndication, personally negotiating a replacement mezzanine financing structure with a lender I'd worked with during my years at the firm, and rewriting the underlying purchase agreement's financing contingency language to buy the additional 4 days we needed to close the new structure properly. The deal closed on schedule, on time, with terms that were, if anything, marginally better than the original structure. I did that work from our kitchen table, in pajamas, unpaid, uncredited beyond Daniel's private gratitude, while Vivian, at a family dinner 2 weeks later, described the deal to visiting relatives as one of Daniel's most impressive closings, without once mentioning that her son had spent those 9 days almost entirely asleep on the office couch while I handled every substantive negotiation myself. But I also want you to understand clearly what this choice cost me over time. I let my bar license lapse in a state I no longer practiced, and actively, I let a partnership track career built over 7 years quietly dissolve into an unpaid, informal role with no title, no equity stake, and, crucially, nothing beyond that original prenuptial agreement documenting my actual contribution to a business I had, in every functional sense, helped run for the better part of a decade. Vivian's treatment of me evolved over those years, in a way I now recognize as a very specific, very deliberate kind of erasure, though it rarely announced itself as such in any single dramatic moment. At family gatherings, she introduced me consistently as Daniel's wife, never once in 11 years as anything connected to the business, despite the fact that by year 6, I was personally reviewing and negotiating every major lease and acquisition contract the company signed. Bradley, who occupied the same protected, groomed successor position in his family that I'd later learn other people's brothers occupied in theirs, treated my involvement in the business with a kind of polite, persistent skepticism, routinely CCing outside counsel on documents I'd already fully reviewed, as though my work required a second, more legitimate opinion. I want to describe one specific instance of this pattern, because I think it captures something the general description alone can't quite convey. In year 7 of the marriage, I negotiated a complex ground lease renewal for one of the company's smaller retail properties, a deal that took nearly 3 months of careful back and forth with a notoriously difficult landlord's counsel, and that I ultimately closed on terms roughly 8% more favorable than the company's own internal projections had anticipated. Bradley, reviewing the final signed lease at a subsequent management meeting, asked, in front of 4 other people, whether the actual attorneys had reviewed the indemnification language before it was executed, apparently unaware, or perhaps simply unwilling to fully register, that I was the actual attorney who had drafted that exact language myself. Daniel, to his credit, corrected him directly and immediately in that meeting, but I remember sitting there, watching Bradley's face register mild, genuine surprise rather than any real embarrassment, and understanding, in that moment, that his assumption hadn't been a deliberate slight so much as an unconscious reflex, built over years of simply never having been trained to categorize me as someone whose professional judgment required the same baseline respect he extended automatically to any outside male attorney the company retained. Caroline. Caroline was gentler, genuinely fond of me in a way that felt real, but even she, at family dinners, would occasionally defer to her grandmother's framing without seeming to notice she was doing it, describing me, once, at a Thanksgiving I remember vividly, as someone who'd found her footing helping out with Dad's company. A phrase that compressed 11 years of complex legal and structural work into something that sounded, to anyone listening, like a hobby. I want to pause here for a moment because I know some of you are already recognizing pieces of your own experience in this, whether it's a marriage, a family business, or simply a lifetime of contribution that somehow never gets named accurately by the people benefiting from it. If that's you, drop a comment with the word unnamed below. I want you to know I see you, and I understand exactly how disorienting it is to do real, load-bearing work inside a story that keeps describing you as decoration. Now back to the story, because the next part is where everything actually turned, though I didn't understand its full significance until much later. About 18 months before Daniel died, he came home from a lunch with his longtime personal attorney, a careful, discreet man named Walter Chin who had handled the Ashworth family's estate planning for over 20 years, and told me, over dinner, in a tone I remember as unusually serious for him, that he decided to make some changes to how the family trust was structured. I want to be honest that I didn't push for details that night, partly out of genuine respect for the fact that estate planning within his family was, understandably, a sensitive and complicated subject given his mother's involvement in the business's history, and partly because I trusted Daniel completely to handle his own family's affairs with the same care he brought to everything else. What I knew, in general terms, was that Daniel had grown increasingly troubled over the preceding year by a specific pattern he'd started to notice in his mother's and Bradley's behavior, an escalating assumption, expressed in small comments here and there, that I was somehow a temporary, replaceable presence in the business's future, someone whose role existed entirely at Daniel's discretion and would presumably end whenever he did. I later learned through Walter Chin the fuller shape of what that dinner conversation had actually set in motion. Daniel had asked Walter to draft a formal amendment to the Ashworth Family Trust, the entity that held, among other things, controlling interest in the company's flagship asset, a mixed-use development called Meridian Tower that represented, by conservative estimate, nearly 40% of the entire portfolio's total value, naming me, specifically, as sole successor trustee of his individual trust share upon his death, with full discretionary authority over that share's management and disposition, superseding, for that specific share, the general family trust's existing governance structure, which had previously required unanimous consent among Vivian, Bradley, and Daniel for any major decision. Walter Chin, in a detail that would later become genuinely significant, had drafted and executed this amendment properly, with all appropriate signatures and witnesses, but had not yet formally recorded and disclosed it to the broader family at Daniel's own explicit request. Daniel had told him, according to Walter's later account, that he wanted to handle the disclosure himself, in his own time, Once he'd found the right moment to have what he anticipated would be a difficult conversation with his mother about it. That right moment, tragically, never arrived. Daniel died 11 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday in March, of a sudden cardiac event at 53, at his desk at the Ashworth Properties office, with no warning, no illness, nothing that gave either of us the chance to prepare for what was coming or to finish the conversations we hadn't yet had. I want to pause the story here for a moment because I know this is a heavy place to sit, and I want to check in with you before we keep going. If you've ever lost someone suddenly, without the chance to finish an important conversation, or watched a family's true character reveal itself in the raw, disorienting days right after a death, drop a comment with the word sudden. I understand, in a way I wish I didn't, exactly how disorienting that specific kind of grief is, and I want you to know you're not alone in it. Now, back to the story, because the days immediately following Daniel's death are the part one still find hardest to talk about, even now. I want to be honest, that grief, in those first 72 hours, made me genuinely useless in any practical sense. I remember very little of the first 2 days beyond a kind of underwater fog, phone calls I don't fully recall making, decisions I let other people make around me because I simply couldn't access the part of my brain that would have questioned them. I remember, specifically, standing in our kitchen the morning after, staring at a coffee mug Daniel had left in the sink 2 days earlier, unable to make myself either wash it or leave it there, and simply standing over it for what I later learned was almost 40 minutes, until a neighbor found me and gently walked me to the couch. I remember signing something at the funeral home that first day. I genuinely don't remember what, though Susan Farrow later confirmed it was a routine authorization form with no substantive legal weight, because someone placed a pen in my hand, and I signed where I was told to sign, the way you follow simple instructions when your own judgment has temporarily gone offline. It was into that fog on the third day that Vivian Ashworth stepped with a clarity and speed that, looking back, I understand now must have been at least partially premeditated, the product of resentments that had been quietly accumulating for 11 years and were simply waiting for an opening. I don't say this to suggest Vivian was somehow inhuman in her own grief. I believe, genuinely, that she loved her son deeply, and that some of what she did in those first days was its own distorted, ungenerous expression of a mother's devastation, a need to control something, anything, in the immediate aftermath of losing her child. But I also believe, having sat with it for 2 years now, that grief and opportunism are not mutually exclusive states, and that a person can be genuinely devastated by a death while simultaneously, almost reflexively, moving to consolidate advantage in its wake. Both things were true of Vivian in those first days, and I've had to make peace with holding both truths at once, rather than needing one to cancel out the other. The obituary I had drafted, the night after Daniel died, with Caroline's help, sitting together at my kitchen table, described him as a devoted husband to me and a loving father to his 2 children, along with the appropriate professional and family history. It ran, as submitted, in the paper's Friday edition. By Sunday, a revised version had run instead, submitted, I later confirmed through the funeral home, by Vivian herself, using her authority as the family's listed primary contact, a version that removed any mention of me entirely, describing Daniel only as the beloved father of Bradley and Caroline and the cherished son of Vivian, with no reference to a wife at all. I found out about the change when a family friend, confused, asked me gently at the visitation why the Sunday paper's version read so differently from the one she'd seen posted online earlier that week. I confronted Vivian about it quietly, in a side room at the funeral home, still in the fog of those first days, more bewildered than angry in that particular moment. She looked at me, evenly, and said the sentence I opened the story with. I don't think it's appropriate to overstate things, Elena. You were someone he was seeing. This family has a legacy to protect, and I won't have that legacy's public record confused by sentiment. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, the way I had to sit with it, standing in a side room at my own husband's funeral, 11 years of marriage reduced, in front of the funeral director and 2 of Daniel's cousins, to the phrase someone he was seeing.
I didn't argue with her that day.
I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters for understanding everything that followed. I was not, in that moment, executing some quiet strategic plan. I was simply, completely, overwhelmed by grief in a way that made conflict feel physically impossible, and some old, familiar instinct in me. The instinct, I'd later realize, of a woman who had spent 11 years absorbing small erasures without ever fully naming them as such, simply defaulted to silence, the same silence I'd practiced at Thanksgiving dinners and engagement toasts for over a decade. 5 days after the funeral, before I had even finished the practical, exhausting logistics of closing out Daniel's personal accounts, I learned, from a colleague who still worked at Ashworth Properties, that the locks on the executive floor of Meridian Tower had been changed over the weekend, and that my building access credentials, along with a company email account I'd used for years to conduct the legal work I'd been doing informally, had been deactivated. Bradley, when I called him, direct and businesslike in a way that felt jarring against the raw grief I was still moving through, explained that given the transition, the family had decided it made sense to streamline operations while they sorted out next steps, and that he was sure I'd understand, since I wasn't, after all, technically an employee or an owner. He said this last part carefully, deliberately, in a tone that told me he'd rehearsed it, possibly with his grandmother, possibly with an attorney, possibly both. Let me pause here again, because I know some of you are wondering why I didn't immediately fight back, hire an attorney, demand my rightful place in a business I'd spent a decade helping build. And I want to answer that honestly, because I think the answer matters more than a dramatic confrontation scene would. If you've ever been so deep in grief that you couldn't access your own anger yet, even when anger would have been the reasonable response, comment, "Not yet," below. I promise you, that delay doesn't make you weak. Sometimes it just means your grief needed to finish arriving before anything else could. Now, back to the story, because the following 4 months are the part where everything my family, Daniel's family, believed about me turned out to be very carefully, very deliberately incomplete. I retained an estate attorney, eventually, about 3 weeks after the funeral, once the fog had lifted just enough for me to understand that some formal process was going to unfold with or without my active participation, and that I needed, at minimum, someone representing my interests in it. I want to be honest that I chose, deliberately, not to disclose to this attorney, a competent but unremarkable local practitioner named Susan Farrow, the full extent of my own legal background. I let her believe, largely because it was simply easier than explaining, that I was a former corporate professional with some general familiarity with legal documents, rather than a lapsed but formerly quite accomplished M&A attorney who had, for the better part of a decade, personally negotiated contracts considerably more complex than anything likely to appear in this particular estate proceeding. I don't fully know why I made that choice, even now. Some part of it, I think, was genuine emotional exhaustion. I simply didn't have the energy in those months to perform competence or strategy for anyone, including my own attorney. Another part of it, I've come to believe, was something closer to curiosity, almost anthropological in its detachment. I wanted, in some quiet, grieving corner of myself, to see exactly how far Daniel's family would actually go if they believed, completely, that I had no professional tools of my own and no fight left in me. The General Trust Administration proceeded, over those months, largely as Vivian and Bradley appeared to expect. Under the family trust's general terms, the terms everyone in that family, including, apparently, Susan Farrow, understood to be the complete and only governing document, Daniel's overall estate outside the trust passed to me as his surviving spouse, a modest but genuinely comfortable sum that included our shared home and a portion of his personal investment accounts, entirely consistent with the prenuptial agreement I'd signed 11 years earlier and had always understood to be fair. His interest in the broader Ashworth family trust, and by extension his stake in Ashworth Properties itself, was understood by everyone at the table to pass, per the trust's general succession provisions, to Bradley and Caroline jointly, with Vivian retaining her substantial existing controlling interest as matriarch. Nobody in that process, for 4 months, mentioned Walter Chen's amendment, and I want to be honest that I don't believe this was, for most of that period, active deception on anyone's part. I believe, genuinely, that Vivian and Bradley did not yet know it existed, and that Walter Chen, bound by a strict interpretation of his professional obligations and Daniel's own explicit prior instruction to handle the disclosure personally, in his own time, was navigating an unusually delicate question. About exactly when and how to bring a document to light that his now-deceased client had never formally authorized him to disclose on his own initiative. I signed every document Susan Farrow's office sent me during those 4 months, carefully reviewing each one. I want to be clear, with the full professional rigor I'd always brought to legal work, but signing them without protest, without negotiation, without ever once revealing to anyone in that family that I understood, better than most people in the room, exactly what each clause meant, and exactly what I was formally relinquishing by agreeing to it. Susan Farrow, at one point, about 10 weeks into the process, pulled me aside after a particularly one-sided negotiation session and said, with genuine concern in her voice, "Elena, I need to say this clearly. I think you're leaving significant value on the table here. Your husband's family is moving very fast, and I don't think they're giving your 11 years in this marriage and whatever role you had in that business the weight it deserves. I'd really like your permission to push back harder." I told her, and I meant this honestly, at the level I was capable of meaning anything in those months, that I appreciated her concern, but that I wanted to let the process play out on its current timeline, and that if anything changed, I would let her know. I want to explain, as honestly as I can, what was actually happening inside me during those 10 weeks, because I think it matters more than the strategic explanation I've sometimes been tempted to offer in hindsight. Part of it, genuinely, was grief so consuming that I simply didn't have the emotional bandwidth to fight a legal battle on top of it, and I've come to believe that choosing not to fight, in that specific window, was itself a legitimate act of self-preservation rather than passivity. But another part of it, quieter and harder to admit even to myself, was a kind of test I hadn't fully articulated even in my own mind, a need to see, with total clarity, exactly how this family would behave toward me if they believed, completely, that I had no leverage left at all. 11 years of small erasures had left me with a persistent, nagging uncertainty about whether I'd ever accurately understood how this family actually saw me, or whether I'd simply absorbed Daniel's kindness as proof that the rest of it didn't matter as much as it did. Those 4 months answered that question with a clarity I'd never quite let myself have before, and as painful as that clarity was, I've come to be strangely grateful for it, grateful, even now, that I got to see exactly what Vivian and Bradley believed about my worth when they thought no consequence was coming for believing it. What I didn't tell her, because I genuinely didn't yet know it with certainty myself, was that I had, in the weeks after Bradley changed the locks on Meridian Tower, placed a single quiet phone call to Walter Chen's office, not to demand anything, but simply to ask, as Daniel's widow, whether there were any estate planning documents beyond what Susan Farrow's office had already received that I should be aware of. Walter, I later learned, had been agonizing, in his own careful, professionally bound way, over exactly this question for weeks, uncertain whether Daniel's instruction to handle it himself, in his own time, survived Daniel's own sudden, premature death, or whether his fiduciary obligation to properly administer the trust now required him to disclose the amendment regardless of that prior instruction. My call, framed simply as a direct, good-faith question from the surviving spouse, gave him, he told me much later, exactly the professional opening he needed to finally resolve that uncertainty in favor of disclosure. He didn't tell me anything on that first call. He simply said, carefully, that he needed to review some files and would be in touch. 6 days later, he requested that a formal hearing be scheduled before the probate court overseeing the estate's administration, citing a document requiring judicial notice that had not yet been entered into the proceedings record. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, for months and 11 days after Daniel's death, in a modest, wood-paneled courtroom downtown that felt, walking in, almost absurdly small for the scale of what I understood, by that point, was about to happen inside it. Vivian sat with Bradley and their attorney, a sharp, expensive litigator named Preston Hale, at one table. I sat with Susan Farrow at the other. In a plain gray suit I'd chosen deliberately, the same understated, unthreatening presentation I'd maintained for 4 months. Caroline sat in the gallery, separate from her grandmother and brother for reasons I didn't yet understand but would come to appreciate deeply in the months that followed. Walter Chen was called first as the estate's original drafting attorney, And I want to describe what happened next as plainly and honestly as I can, because the truth of that courtroom was quieter and more procedural than anything a dramatized version of this story might suggest. Walter explained, methodically, in the careful, unemotional language of a man who has spent 30 years learning to let documents speak for themselves, that 18 months before his death, Daniel Ashworth Marsh had executed a formal amendment to his individual share of the Ashworth Family Trust, properly witnessed and notarized, naming his spouse, Elena Marsh, as sole successor trustee of that share, with full discretionary authority over its management and disposition, specifically, including, per the amendment's explicit language, controlling interest in the Meridian Tower asset held within that share. I watched Preston Hale's face throughout that explanation, and I want to be honest that some old part of me, 11 years in the making, expected some dramatic, immediate objection, some sharp legal maneuver designed to discredit the document on the spot. What actually happened was quieter, and in some ways more devastating to watch, because I understood, watching it unfold, that Preston Hale genuinely had not known this document existed before that morning. His own clients, Vivian and Bradley, had never disclosed to him even the possibility of its existence, likely because they themselves had never fully understood, in 11 years of treating me as a temporary presence in the family story, that Daniel had spent his final year and a half, quietly, deliberately building a legal structure specifically designed to protect me from exactly the treatment they'd just spent 4 months giving me. Preston Hale asked, carefully, to review the amendment directly, and I watched him read it, silently, at the table, his expression shifting slowly from professional neutrality into something closer to genuine alarm as he reached, I assume, the specific clause naming me as sole trustee with full discretionary authority, superseding the trust's general unanimous consent requirement for that particular share. He set the document down, looked at Vivian, and I watched, in that small, wood-paneled courtroom, the exact moment his own composure, the same easy, expensive confidence I imagine he'd carried into 100 estate proceedings before this one, visibly, audibly faltered. He asked the judge for a brief recess. Let me pause the story here, because I know this is the moment you've been waiting for, and I want to describe it honestly rather than dramatically, because the truth of that recess was quieter than anything scripted. During the 15-minute break, Vivian approached me directly, for the first time in 4 months without an attorney standing between us, and asked, in a voice I'd never heard from her before, stripped of its usual polished certainty, "Did you know about this? This whole time, did you know?" I told her the truth, that I had learned of its existence only 6 days before this hearing, through a single good-faith inquiry to Walter Chen's office, and that I had signed every document her attorney sent me over the preceding 4 months, without ever once relying on or referencing this amendment, because until 6 days earlier, I hadn't known it existed. I watched her absorb that answer, and I watched something complicated move across her face. Not quite shame, not quite regret, but something adjacent to both. The specific expression of a woman confronting the possibility that her own son had spent his final 18 months quietly correcting a mistake she had spent 11 years actively, deliberately making. Let me pause here one more time, because I know some of you are wondering how the rest of that hearing actually resolved, and I promise we're getting there. But I want you to sit with this moment first, because I think it matters. If you've ever watched someone finally understand, too late, the exact cost of how they treated you, comment "too late to matter, but not too late to notice" below. I understand exactly how complicated that particular kind of indication can feel. Now, back to the story, because the resolution, once the hearing resumed, was almost entirely anticlimactic in its procedural correctness, which I've come to believe is its own quiet, powerful kind of justice. The judge, a measured, unhurried woman named Judge Alvarez, who had clearly presided over a great many estate disputes considerably uglier than this one, reviewed the amendment's execution formalities herself, confirmed with Walter Chen that it had been properly witnessed and notarized in full compliance with the state's requirements, and confirmed, further, that nothing in the document's language or circumstances suggested any irregularity in its drafting or execution. She noted, for the record, that the amendment as written was unambiguous, and that absent any credible challenge to its validity, which Preston Hale, after his own careful review, ultimately declined to formally raise, given the document's clean execution and Walter Chen's unimpeachable 30-year professional standing. The trust would be administered exactly as Daniel Ashworth Marsh had specified, 18 months before his death, with me installed as sole successor trustee of his individual share, including controlling interest in Meridian Tower. I want to be honest about what I did with that authority once it was formally confirmed, because I think it matters more than the hearing itself did. I did not use my new position to punish Vivian or Bradley out of retribution for 4 months of casual cruelty layered on top of 11 years of quiet erasure. I did something, instead, that I believe honors both the letter and the spirit of what Daniel actually intended when he sat down with Walter Chen 18 months earlier. I retained my controlling interest in Meridian Tower, formally accepted the trustee role, and, working with the company's existing operational leadership, ensured the asset continued to be managed professionally and profitably, exactly as it had been under Daniel's direct involvement for over a decade. I want to give you one specific example of how that authority actually played out in practice, because I think it illustrates something important about what I chose to do with it. About 4 months after the hearing, Bradley approached the building's management team with a proposal to convert a portion of Meridian Tower's second-floor retail space into additional leasable office square footage, a change that would have required amending the trust's underlying management agreement and that, under the amendment's terms, required my sign-off as sole trustee of that share. My old instinct, if I'm honest, was to view the request with suspicion, half expecting some hidden maneuver designed to dilute my authority or extract value on Bradley's behalf specifically. Instead, I did what I would have done for any client during my years practicing law. I asked my own commercial real estate consultant to review the underlying market data independently, found that Bradley's proposal was, on its actual merits, a sound one that would meaningfully increase the asset's long-term value, and approved it, with 2 modest structural modifications my consultant recommended to protect the trust's downside risk. Bradley, I later learned from Caroline, was genuinely surprised by how straightforwardly I'd engaged with the proposal, having apparently braced himself for a much harder fight. I told Caroline when she mentioned it that I had never actually wanted to be difficult with this family. I had only ever wanted to be seen accurately, and those, it turned out, were 2 very different things that 11 years of living inside this family's assumptions had made me forget how to distinguish. I did not attempt to seize control of the broader Ashworth Properties portfolio beyond what the amendment specifically granted me, and I declined, when Preston Hale later inquired, almost apologetically, whether I intended to pursue any further claims related to the 4 months of exclusion I'd experienced before the hearing, to bring any additional legal action, though Susan Farrow, to her credit, made clear I would have had a genuinely strong case had I chosen to pursue one. What I did do in the months that followed was something quieter and, I think, ultimately more meaningful than any additional legal victory could have been. I requested, and was granted, a formal meeting with Vivian and Bradley, without attorneys present, at a neutral location, a small conference room at a hotel downtown, chosen specifically because it belonged to neither of our histories. I told them, plainly, that I had no interest in weaponizing my new authority against them, that Meridian Tower would continue to be managed for the benefit of the entire family's broader financial interests, exactly as it always had been, but that I would no longer accept being described, in any context, professional or personal, as someone who had merely been seeing their son and father for 11 years. I told them that the 11 years of legal and structural work I had done for Ashworth Properties, entirely unpaid, entirely uncredited, had been real, and that I expected, going forward, for that reality to be acknowledged, not out of financial entitlement, but simply out of basic accuracy. Vivian, to her credit, and I want to give her genuine credit here because I think it matters, did not offer excuses. She sat with what I'd said for a long moment, and then she said, quietly, I think I decided who you were before I ever really let myself find out, and I think Daniel knew that, and I think this is his way of making sure I finally had to. It wasn't quite an apology, not fully. But it was, I believe, the most honest sentence she'd said to me in 11 years, and I've chosen to accept it as a genuine starting point, even if I remain, even now, uncertain of exactly how far our relationship will ever be able to travel from that starting point. Bradley's reckoning has been slower and remains, if I'm honest, largely unresolved. He has not apologized directly for changing the locks on Meridian Tower before his father's memorial service had even concluded, though he has, in the 2 years since, become notably more careful and more consultative in his professional interactions with me regarding the property's management, treating my authority, at minimum, as a fact of his business life that requires genuine engagement rather than casual dismissal. I've decided that's a starting point too, even if it isn't the full reckoning I might once have wanted from him. I want to describe one specific interaction with Bradley from about a year after the hearing because I think it illustrates the particular, incomplete shape our relationship has settled into. We were both attending a routine quarterly asset review meeting, one of the few settings where our paths still regularly cross, and afterward, in the parking garage, he stopped me, somewhat awkwardly, and said, "I want you to know I've thought a lot about those first few months. I don't have a good explanation for the locks thing beyond panic and bad advice from people who should have known better." I told him I appreciated him saying that, and I meant it, genuinely, even though it fell short of the fuller accountability I sometimes still find myself wishing for. He hasn't raised the subject again since, and I've stopped waiting for him to. I've learned, through this whole ordeal, that some people offer you the version of accountability they're actually capable of giving, and that insisting on a fuller version they don't yet have access to usually just leaves you waiting indefinitely for something that may never arrive. Bradley gave me a parking garage and one honest sentence. I've decided to let that be enough for now, without pretending it constitutes everything I once might have wanted from him. I think, often, about the particular kind of quiet that settled over those 4 months between Daniel's death and that hearing, the specific discipline of doing careful, honest work inside a family that had already decided, collectively and almost instantly, exactly how little of me was real. I think about the coffee mug I couldn't bring myself to wash, and the pen someone placed in my hand at the funeral home, and the version of myself that sat through Vivian's toast at our engagement dinner 11 years earlier, smiling, absorbing a framing about what I might try to take that I now understand had been quietly shaping this family's expectations of me from the very first night I ever sat at their table. I don't know that I would have believed, on that engagement dinner night, that 11 years and one devastating loss later, I would end up exactly where I am now, not triumphant exactly, not fully healed, but genuinely, solidly myself again, in a way I'm not certain I ever fully was during the years I spent quietly accommodating a family that had already decided, long before I ever had the chance to prove otherwise, who I was allowed to be. Caroline, of everyone in that family, has become someone genuinely important to my life since Daniel's death, in a way that has surprised and moved me more than almost anything else in this entire story. She reached out to me privately about 2 weeks after the hearing and told me she'd known, for years, that her grandmother's treatment of me was unfair and that she'd never had the courage, as the youngest, least powerful voice in that family's particular hierarchy, to say so directly. I think watching that hearing, she told me over coffee a few weeks later, was the first time I understood that being quiet about something unfair doesn't actually keep you neutral. It just keeps you complicit a little more every single time. We talk regularly now, real conversations, and last spring, she asked me, genuinely curious, to walk her through some of the actual legal and structural decisions I'd made on Meridian Tower over the years, and she listened, taking notes, the way you listen to someone you finally decided to actually see clearly. I want to tell you about one more moment with Caroline because I think it captures something important about how genuine repair actually looks, as opposed to the dramatic, single conversation version we sometimes expect from stories like this. About a year after the hearing, Caroline finished her graduate program and told me, hesitantly, that she'd been offered a position at an urban planning firm in another city, a genuinely exciting opportunity, but that she felt guilty even considering it, given everything the family had been through, and given, specifically, her awareness that Vivian would likely see her leaving as another abandonment on top of an already fractured year. I told her, as someone who had spent 11 years shrinking her own ambitions to fit inside a family's comfort, that I hoped she would take the job, and that I would rather see her build an honest, fully expressed life somewhere else than watch her quietly diminish herself the way I once had, in the name of a peace that was never actually being offered to her in return.
She took the job.
She calls me most Sundays now, from her new city, and I've come to think of those calls as one of the most unexpected, genuinely healing outcomes of this entire ordeal. Not a reconciliation with the family that hurt me, exactly, but the emergence of a real, chosen relationship with the one person in that family who was willing to actually do the work of seeing clearly once she was finally given the room to. I want to tell you honestly what I did with my own life, beyond the trust itself, because I think it matters as much as anything else in the story. About 8 months after the hearing, I reinstated my bar license in the state I now lived in, completing the necessary continuing education requirements over a period of intense, genuinely joyful study that reminded me, more than anything else in those 2 years, of exactly who I'd been before 11 years of quiet erasure had convinced me, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to shrink my own professional identity down to something invisible enough to fit inside other people's comfort. I remember the specific afternoon the reinstatement letter arrived, a plain envelope from the State Bar Association that I opened standing in our kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd once restructured a 9-figure financing deal in my pajamas without anyone beyond Daniel ever fully knowing it. I sat down at that same table and cried, not from sadness exactly, but from something closer to a long-delayed recognition, the strange, specific grief of realizing how many years I'd spent believing that my own professional identity was a reasonable thing to set down entirely for someone else's comfort, and the equally strange relief of understanding, finally, that I was allowed to pick it back up. I called my old mentor from the Chicago firm that same afternoon, a formidable retired partner named Diane Okonkwo-Reyes who had championed my early career and who I hadn't spoken to in nearly 6 years, and told her everything, not just the reinstatement, but the whole story, the obituary, the locks, the hearing, all of it in one long, unbroken phone call that lasted nearly 2 hours. She listened without interrupting, the way good mentors do, and at the end of it, she said something I've held on to since. "You didn't lose those 11 years, Elena. You just spent them building a case you didn't know yet you'd eventually need to make. That's not the same as losing them. That's just a longer runway than most people get." I opened a small boutique legal practice 18 months ago, focused specifically on estate and trust litigation, work I chose deliberately, given everything I'd lived through, because I believe, more than almost any other attorney could, in the particular, specific importance of making sure people's actual final intentions, not the convenient version their families would prefer to believe, are the version that actually survives them in the world, long after the people who loved them are no longer in the room to insist on it themselves. My first significant case at the new practice involved a widow in circumstances that echoed my own more closely than I expected when I agreed to take it on, a woman whose late husband's adult children were attempting to exclude her from a family business using exactly the kind of quiet, procedural erasure I'd once experienced myself. I won that case, decisively, using every hard-earned instinct those 11 years had given me, and I remember sitting across from that client afterward, watching relief move across her face in a way that felt, to me, like the clearest possible use of everything I'd survived, the exact moment my own difficult history finally became, in the most concrete way I could imagine, useful to someone else standing in the version of the fog I once stood in myself. I keep, in my office, a framed copy of Walter Chen's original amendment letter, not the operative legal document itself, but the cover letter he sent alongside it, dated 18 months before Daniel's death, that begins, simply, "Per our conversation, please find enclosed the amendment we discussed. I understand you'll handle the family conversation in your own time." I think, often, about the fact that Daniel never found that time, that some conversations simply run out of clock before we're ready for them to, and that the only thing any of us can actually control is whether we did the underlying work anyway, quietly, correctly, even without the chance to explain it out loud to the people who needed to hear it. I've thought a great deal, in the 2 years since, about what it actually means that Daniel chose to protect me this way without ever having the conversation with his mother directly. Part of me wishes, achingly, that he had found the courage to have that difficult dinner with Vivian while he still could, sparing me the 4 months of quiet cruelty that followed his death entirely. But another part of me, the part that has spent a career reading what people actually do rather than what they say they intend to do, has come to understand his silence differently. Daniel knew, I believe, exactly how that conversation would have gone, the same defensive, wounded reaction I eventually watched play out in that hotel conference room, except delivered while he was still alive to absorb the fallout of it, still building relationships with his own mother and children that a premature confrontation might have permanently fractured. He chose, instead, to let the document itself carry the weight of that conversation, on a schedule he couldn't fully control, trusting Walter Chen's professional judgment and, I think, trusting me to handle whatever that schedule eventually demanded of me. I don't know that I would have made the same choice, faced with the same impossible calculation. But I've made my peace with it because I understand, now, that it was the choice of a man trying to protect two things simultaneously that could not have been protected in the same conversation: his family's fragile, complicated peace, and his wife's actual, factual worth. He chose to let time and documentation handle what he couldn't bring himself to say out loud, and in the end, quietly, patiently, exactly as he must have hoped, it did. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: the people who decide, in the wake of a loss, to treat your grief as an inconvenience standing between them and what they've already decided belongs to them are rarely making an honest assessment of what you actually meant to the person you lost. They are usually protecting a version of the family story that was always more comfortable without you fully in it. I spent 11 years being quietly written out of a business I helped build, and 4 months being actively erased from a grief I had every legitimate right to. What I learned, eventually, is that the truth doesn't need me to fight loudly for it in the moment it's being denied. Sometimes it just needs me to keep doing honest, careful work, and to trust that the people who loved me well enough to notice will have already made sure that work gets its due, on its own schedule, whether I'm in the room to argue for it or not. I want to leave you with one last thought because I think it matters more than any single detail of the hearing itself. For 4 months, I let an entire family believe I had nothing left to offer in my own defense, and I want to be honest that there were nights during that period when I nearly believed it myself, when the fog of grief made it genuinely difficult to trust that anything solid still existed underneath everything I'd lost. What got me through wasn't certainty that I'd eventually be vindicated. I didn't know, for most of those 4 months, that any vindication was coming at all. What got me through was simply continuing to do the next honest thing in front of me, one document, one quiet phone call, one careful decision at a time, without needing to know in advance how the larger story would end. I think that's the part of this whole experience I'd most want anyone watching, sitting in their own version of that fog right now, to actually take with them, more than any of the specific legal details or the specific family names involved. You don't need a courtroom or a trust amendment to know the truth of what you built and who you were to someone, even when the people left behind try to rewrite it in front of you. Sometimes the truest kind of justice isn't about winning the argument in the room where the cruelty happens. It's about the 11 years before that room, when you did the real work, quietly, honestly, entirely on its own merits, long before anyone else was forced to finally admit it had been real the whole time. It's about trusting, even in the hardest, foggiest months, that honest work rarely stays invisible forever, even when it feels, in the moment, like it might. Thank you for staying with me through this one, all the way to the end. If any part of this reminded you of your own family, your own quiet years of being written out of a story you actually helped build, or your own version of a fog you weren't sure you'd find your way out of, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, about grief nobody let you fully have, about patient boundaries, about the specific, quiet kind of justice that arrives on its own schedule instead of anyone else's, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one.